The principle of our work, which is its heart and center line, is really the ideology of a democracy.
He took dreams and created some of the world's most remarkable places. Places to live. Places to gather. And places to work.
He used to say that architecture was like going to church because it made you think about things intellectually and spiritually.
He loved nature. He loved humanity. He wanted you to feel comfortable and cozy in a home. He wanted you to feel comfortable in an office building. He wanted you to feel comfortable and worshipful in the church. Look at the Johnson Wax as an example. The building became tremendously famous when it opened. People wanted to go to work there. The ladies chose to have that Christmas service in the building where they worked. That's why people today are so drawn to his work.
This may be Frank Lloyd Wright's last dream. A $67 million convention center called the Monona Terrace. Hello, I'm Bill Curtis. Wright called this building a great gift to his boyhood home of Madison, Wisconsin. But it's also the story of an artist's journey. An incredible 92-year journey from his boyhood in southern Wisconsin to his place among the world's great artists. Within the story of this building is the story of Frank Lloyd Wright, his trials and triumphs, his failures and successes.
Mr. Wright's a hometown boy, and you sometimes feel about a hometown boy differently than you feel about other people.
Frank Lloyd Wright proposed the Monona Terrace for Madison in 1938. He called it a dream civic center. It would curve out over Lake Monona, a lake he knew as a boy.
Well, he felt that Madison's great beauty was being on the isthmus between two lakes, and the city should take advantage of that. And that's what Monona Terrace did.
It would be a place where a community comes together, and a place that would divide the same community for almost 60 years. On one side, a group who wanted a public building from the world's greatest architect. On the other, a group who thought Wright was an immoral man who never paid his debts. It is possibly the most contested building in American history.
He was still tainted with this profit without honor business that is just a penalty you pay for staying in your hometown.
Madison loved to repeat the scandalous stories about Frank Lloyd Wright. Stories of leaving his wife and 6 children for a client's wife. Stories of his beloved Taliesin, the home in Spring Green he built for his new life, only to see his lover murdered in a bizarre fire that destroyed Taliesin and almost himself. Stories that played before his hometown like a tragic opera.
There's no halfway about an opinion about Frank Lloyd Wright. Either you admired him and cherished the idea of it and cherished the fact that you met him and knew him, or you hate him. You hate everything about him. You hated his personal life, his way of doing it, and so on and so on. So there's no wishy-washy.
I would say the greatest thing about Wright was his uncompromising principles which he believed in, that he did not give up or give in to style, to convention, to mores, to you name it, whatever it prevails at a certain time. If he believed in something, he stuck with it. And that was his greatest greatest accomplishment. Now you can also, I mean, his moral standards were not the greatest. He didn't even give in on that.
Architect, scoundrel, revolutionary, rascal. These notions of Frank Lloyd Wright dominate the story of the Monona Terrace, a building about to be considered among his other works, and a building destined to fulfill Frank Lloyd Wright's last dream. How this city, this countryside, and his family influenced a school of architecture when Frank Lloyd Wright's last dream continues.
My mother was a teacher, and she wanted an architect for a son. I happened to be the son, and of course, naturally, an architect.
He was born Frank Lincoln Wright on June 8, 1867, in Richland Center, Wisconsin, to William Carey Wright, a Baptist minister, and Anna Lloyd Jones, a country school teacher.
Of course, his mother was enamored of architecture and determined before he was born that the child she was carrying would be a boy who grew up to build beautiful buildings.
His mother's family, the Lloyd Joneses, emigrated to Wisconsin from Wales in 1846 and settled in this valley near the Wisconsin River. They were preachers, teachers, and farmers. They were religious rebels with a passion for education. They even had a family motto: truth against the world.
Mr. Wright came from several generations of rebels. That was the reason they left Wales and came to the United States, is because they were rebels. And Mr. Wright certainly continued that tradition.
Wright's family built their homes, farms, and a chapel in this Wisconsin River Valley. It's here his mother sent Frank to work on his uncle's farm. It is here he built Taliesin, his home from 1911 until his death in 1959. And it is this valley that influenced the architect's concept of architecture: build in harmony with nature.
But the family was a Unitarian transcendental family. They believed in the sanctity of nature. They believed that the closer man lived with nature, the more he benefited from it. So that was implanted in Frank Lloyd Wright from the time he was a boy.
William and Anna settled their family in Madison in 1880, 40 miles east of Anna's family in the valley. They lived on the Isthmus, a section of downtown between Madison's two prominent lakes. Frank had average to poor grades in school. There's no record he graduated from high school. Frank Wright matured in Madison. He claimed to see the collapse of a wing of the Capitol not far from his home. He told of watching twisted bodies being removed from the rubble and how the sight haunted him for days. A Wright building never collapsed. The marriage of William and Anna Wright ended in divorce in 1887. How this affected young Frank is not clear, but he would later write that his father abandoned the family, something he would also do as a father. He never saw his father again or attended his funeral.
In Madison, we were poor. We had no money to send me to an architectural school, and Madison, our home, had an engineering school.
With no high school diploma and not much money, Frank enrolled in the University of Wisconsin as a special student in 1886. He worked for an engineering professor and assisted on the construction of his first building, Science Hall, that still stands on campus. He claimed he attended the university for 3.5 years, leaving just one course short of graduation. In fact, he attended for parts of 2 academic years. It was his last formal education. It was also the last time he lived in Madison. In 1887, he left school for a new career in a new city with a new name. He took his mother's Welsh family name and would forever be known as Frank Lloyd Wright. While Frank Lloyd Wright left Madison in 1887, it would remain for all intents and purposes his hometown. He returned many times to build homes and a church. And because he built his home just 40 miles west of Madison in Spring Green, it remained the center of his business and cultural life. And in 1938, he would design what he called his great gift to his hometown, the Monona Terrace. But in 1887, just shy of 20 years old, Frank Lloyd Wright was on his way to Chicago, where he became part of the birth of modern American architecture.
I was anxious to be an architect, and so I started out for Chicago.
Early in 1887, Frank Lloyd Wright left the University of Wisconsin and boarded a train for Chicago.
Think of a person at the age of 20, living in the Valley, or living in Madison, which was pretty rural, it was not much a sophisticated city, arrives in Chicago to get a job as an architect, working for an architect, drizzling, raining, cold in spring. He sees for the first time electric light. He sees for the first time the slaughterhouses, the trolleys, the noise, the congestion. What he's dipped into from this tranquil, Unitarian, transcendental background, he is plunged into the Industrial Revolution. And that would tear both people apart. But he saw a wonderful combination, what the machine can do to liberate man, what the machine can do to liberate art.
Chicago was the perfect city for an aspiring architect in 1887. It was still rebuilding after the fire of 1871 that destroyed 17,000 buildings and left 100,000 people homeless.
And then he began to meet all kinds of young revolutionaries like himself. He was by one of these other people he brought to Sullivan. And Sullivan and he just hit it off beautifully.
Louis Sullivan quickly became Wright's mentor. He was a partner in the busy Chicago architectural firm of Adler and Sullivan. Adler and Sullivan became the architectural school he could not afford in Wisconsin.
Sullivan ran the design department. See, they would get a client, and Sullivan might be at lunch with the client, and he would make a doodle on a drawing on a menu. And he would take it back and throw it on Wright's desk, and he'd say, Wright, draw it up.
Wright soon began to build homes on his own and keep the money for himself. Wright also became a husband and father while working for Adler and Sullivan. On June 1st, 1889, Wright married 18-year-old Catherine Tobin. He borrowed $5,000 from Sullivan to build this home on Forest Avenue in the Chicago suburb of Oak Park. Frank and Catherine raised 6 children here. Today, Frank Lloyd Wright's home and studio survive as one of his masterworks. It is here we get the first look at his architecture. We see how one space flows into another, his use of materials, his experiments with light, and his use of the fireplace as the center gathering place for the family. Wright was forced to open his own practice in 1894 when Adler and Sullivan discovered his moonlighting and fired him. Wright now found himself adding a studio to his Oak Park home and announcing to the world that he was Frank Lloyd Wright's architect.
He had, for the 18 years he was in Oak Park practicing, a steady stream of clients who built. They figured that every 6 weeks they were turning out a new set of working drawings. 80% of his Oak Park work was built. His clients were conservative, upper-class businessmen.
The themes he developed in Oak Park stayed with him throughout his 72-year career. Wright called it organic architecture.
And we try to put into that house a sense of unity of the altogether that makes it part of its site. If the thing is successful, the architect's effort, you can't imagine that house anywhere than right where it is.
But they saw something beautifully and wonderfully American in his work. They deplored his personal life, but they knew what he was building was good. So he was no starving artist in the garret. He was starving because he was a lavish spender.
But his Oak Park neighbors rejected his personal life. In 1909, Wright fell in love with the wife of a client, Mamah Borthwick Cheney. They left their families and sailed for Germany. The public affair was the first of many scandals to follow.
His own description of why he left, he fell in love with the wife of one of his clients, Mamah Borthwick Cheney. Also, he said that by 1909 he was sort of tired of his domestic life and tired of his work life. It was time to make a change. And he made a very abrupt change, which was a very controversial, unconventional, and unacceptable change at that time. In 1909, you just don't go off to Europe with the wife of another client and leave 6 children and your own wife behind. And he paid an terrible price for it.
It was only the beginning. Wright built 135 buildings by 1911. He was the star of his profession. He was among the pioneers of modern American architecture. He was a popular speaker and writer. He was also getting a reputation that would follow him the rest of his life. From his work in Chicago through the proposal of the Monona Terrace, Wright's personal reputation was now a factor in whether a Wright design became a building. Wright returns to the valley of his youth to build his biography in stone, when Frank Lloyd Wright's last dream continues.
I was getting a worm's eye view of society and needed to get into the country, and my mother had prepared this site for me and asked me to come and take it, and I did.
While Frank Lloyd Wright and Mamah Borthwick Cheney escaped to Europe, the scandal continued back home. Then, almost as suddenly as he left, Wright returned home without Mamah Cheney. Catherine and the children welcomed him home, but his Oak Park neighbors and many of his potential clients avoided him. In 1911, Wright again returned to the valley near Spring Green, his aunts and uncles still called home. He built himself a home here and called it Taliesin, Welsh for shining brow. The press called it a love bungalow when Mamah Cheney joined him at Taliesin. Wright told the press the best he could do for his family was leave. Through the scandal, Wright continued to work in Chicago and traveled to Tokyo to propose a design for a major hotel. While Wright was away at work in Chicago, tragedy struck Taliesin. A Taliesin servant served lunch to Mamah, her 2 children, and 6 others. Then, without warning, he bolted the dining room doors, splashed the walls with gasoline, and set Taliesin on fire. He then murdered 7 of the 9 diners with his axe. Among them, Mamah Borthwick Cheney and her 2 children. Taliesin was destroyed. Mamah Borthwick was dead. Wright was devastated. But his studio somehow survived the fire, and as the ashes cooled, Wright dedicated himself to rebuilding Taliesin. He would live in this valley his grandparents settled for the rest of his life. It was this valley, the valley he knew as a boy, that would be the genesis for some of the greatest buildings of the 20th century. In 1914, a stranger wrote Wright to offer her condolences for his loss of Mamah Borthwick. The letter was from Maud Miriam Noel, the 45-year-old daughter of a plantation owner, and as Wright would find out later, a morphine addict. Soon, Wright and Noel met, fell in love, and by the summer of 1915, Miriam Noel was living at a rebuilt Taliesin. He was still officially married to Catherine and did not marry Miriam until 1924. 6 months later, she left him. Later that year, he met the woman who would become the 3rd Mrs. Frank Lloyd Wright. Olgavana Lazovic was a dancer from Yugoslavia. She was 26. Wright was 57. By early 1925, Olgavana was the woman of Taliesin. When Wright sued Miriam Noel for divorce in 1925, Olgavana was 4 months pregnant. Miriam then sued Olgavana for $100,000 for alienation of affection, and the newspapers reported every dirty detail. The battle raged. Wright was sued, investigated by the government, forced to run from the law, and when caught, jailed. Miriam harassed Olgivanna in her hospital bed and complained to immigration authorities about her status in the United States. Wright feared the deportation of Olgivanna and that he himself would be charged with violating immigration laws. The month after Wright filed for divorce, Taliesin burned again, this time because of a short circuit. Wright began again, sifting through the rubble for stones to rebuild, stones still visible in Taliesin 3. Once the third Taliesin was complete, Miriam, still legally Wright's wife, claimed half of it. She brought newspaper photographers along in her attempts to enter Taliesin. She never got through the gate, but the pictures made the papers. The Miriam chapter in Frank Lloyd Wright's life ended when she died following an operation in January of 1930. While Wright's personal problems seemed to be behind him, his professional problems were immediate. The Great Depression was on, and work for architects, no matter how famous, was drying up fast. Wright was now 63 years old, and many thought his best work was behind him. Frank Lloyd Wright did not agree. Neither did Olgivanna. As the commissions dried up, she encouraged her husband to lecture and write his autobiography.
And got tremendous reviews. It's amazing, the reviews that came out all across the nation. It was as though they had forgiven this period of his life, which was so tumultuous and so terrifying, not so much for him as for her, coming to America from Europe in 1924 and being treated as though she were a prostitute, being put in jail.
Olgivanna Wright next suggested her husband enroll students in a type of architectural school. In October of 1932, the Taliesin Fellowship opened. It was a new way to study architecture, and for the Wrights, a new way to generate income.
By 1932, there was no work. He was poverty-stricken. But where did he get the money? People say it must have been, oh, you must have been a very unusual person to be accepted. Anybody who could pay for the tuition could get in. I mean, you can't run a school without students.
Apprentices did more than sit at the master's sleeve. They milked the cows, planted the garden, tore down and built sections of Taliesin at the whim of the master, cooked the meals, arranged the dining room, sang in the choir, and acted in the plays. It taught that architecture was more than walls and ceilings. It was where and how we lived. It was part of us. It was organic.
We got a terrific practical approach. And the practical approach gets you ready for anything. And I think the education that he gave us gives us a look at the world in a much different way than an academic look at the world. The academic look is you're always relating to something that happened in the past. But what about now? And what about tomorrow and the future and the future?
And after breakfast, somebody would ask Mr. Wright a question, or maybe he would have a thought that he wanted to start talking about. He would talk to us for 35 or 40 minutes. And what he was saying was so filled with new ideas, but ideas that you totally understood, that I would feel like my mind was being set on fire.
Wright turned 70 on June 8, 1937. He built some of his most famous buildings in the last 25 years of his life. He told his apprentices he could shake ideas from his sleeve, and they watched him do it.
And then Herbert Johnson was getting ready to build an administration building, I think his daughter Karen, and he already had an architect with plans. And Karen said, but Daddy, the world's greatest architect is just 70 miles away. So they came up to see Mr. Wright and come to the Johnson Wax building. And then they began to roll.
The Johnson Wax Building in Racine, Wisconsin is a revolutionary place to work, and one of the few workplaces in the world that still attracts tourists. He built Falling Water, among the most famous homes in America, that sits directly over a waterfall in the hills of western Pennsylvania. In Madison, he built the Jacobs House, the first of his Usonian homes, designed to provide affordable housing for people with average incomes. In the desert near Phoenix, he built Taliesin West, that became the winter home of the Taliesin Fellowship. And for the city of Madison, Wisconsin, he designed his dream civic center, the Monona Terrace. But what Wright could not have imagined was the intensity of the controversy that would follow his proposal, a controversy he would not outlive.
Architecture being a blind spot of the nation, nobody who has been educated, at least, knowing what constitutes the virtue of a building. Now, how are you going to get judgment? You'll get damnation, not judgment.
On November 1st, 1938, the 71-year-old Frank Lloyd Wright stood before the Dane County Board and presented a plan for a building he promised would make Madison a Mecca. He was commissioned by a group of Madison citizens who were opposed to the plan to build a city-county building already before the board. It was one of Wright's most ambitious designs, a massive structure curving over a lake that would include city and county offices, a community rooftop park, auditoriums, convention space, and exhibition halls. There would be a railroad station, a bus depot, and a marina, courtrooms, and a jail with a view of the lake. Wright predicted his Monona Terrace would lead the way for cities all over the world. What he did not predict was the prolonged fight that followed.
It was a very nasty political fight about Wright's reputation. He had the disadvantage of having come from Madison. People here knew him, and most of the people who were fighting with him at the time over at Monona Terrace had actually known him as an adult, not as a child or a young person. Remember, he was 20 to 30 to 40 years older than the persons who were attacking him. They had known him all their lives.
The fight started that November night in 1938. After Wright's presentation, the board voted not to approve the original city-county building proposal by a single vote. By doing so, they forfeited hundreds of thousands of dollars in federal aid. But the board did not approve Wright's plan either. For the next 5 decades, people were either for or against Wright's Monona Terrace plan. Supporters called him a genius. Opponents called him a rascal.
I would like to say that the reason it took 60 years to build it was that there were too many rascals in Madison who stopped Mr. Wright from building it, because that was really the reason it wasn't built for so long, is there were a lot of people there. It was Mr. Wright's hometown, and there were a lot of people who felt that they didn't want a Frank Lloyd Wright building in Madison. So that's why it was stopped so long. So the rascal is applied in the wrong instance.
By the time Wright proposed the Monona Terrace, he was nationally known for his radical views on everything from architecture to American politics.
I think the common man is responsible for the drift toward conformity now. That is going to ruin our democracy and is not according to our democratic faith.
In Madison, Wright unsuccessfully continued to urge the county board to adopt his plan. In 1941, Madison voters approved the money to build a city auditorium. Wright revised his 1938 design and suggested the city consider it, since it already included an auditorium. It was, however, 1941, and all debate surrounding the Monona Terrace stopped as America entered World War II.
War. He's entirely against war in general. He's against it particularly because it affects him. His ego, his building, he's going to do these great things. So he has to sweat out that war.
I'm against war, always have been, always will be. And anything connected with it is anathema to me. I've never considered it necessary. And I think one war only breeds another.
He opposed World War II. He sent his boys to prison, and indeed 4 apprentices or 3 did end up in prison as conscientious objectors, although under differing circumstances for each. He did not have the business community, and many of these men were associated with the business community, in his pocket, not because he didn't pay his bills, but because of the kind of person he was politically, socially, intellectually. His stand on politics, international economics, all of these things hurt him in different ways with different people in different combinations within the same community.
Wright's criticism of the war drew the attention of J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI. The FBI investigated Wright for his alleged efforts to urge his apprentices to dodge the draft. An FBI report called Taliesin a religious cult that conducted dances to the moon. Hoover wanted Wright charged with sedition. He was not, but soon opponents of Wright's Monona Terrace plan had another weapon.
And in Madison, the greatest opponent he has was Colonel Jackson, who had nothing to do with architecture. I mean, the fact that he was a pacifist, that he was against the war, that he encouraged people not to join the army. I mean, that's Colonel Jackson's reason for not wanting to design a building for Madison.
After the war, the county and city again agreed to build a city-county building. The city of Madison again called for a civic center and auditorium, and Wright again went into his vault and proposed the Monona Terrace. In 1953, the county finally rejected Wright's proposal and signed an agreement with another architectural firm. But the city of Madison still wanted a city auditorium, and this time the voters would decide where and who would build it. In November of 1954, Madison voters overwhelmingly approved the Lake Monona site and narrowly approved Wright as its architect. For the first time in 16 years, it looked like Frank Lloyd Wright's dream would break ground.
And when he revised it in the 50s, still trying to make it something beautiful for the city. Let's bring the city down onto the lake. Let's bring the lake up into the city, you know, give it a wonderful marriage of the site. Let's make the top of the thing a park. You know, the whole thing was to make it something beautiful for the citizens.
But there were still battles to fight. The next battle came from the town of Spring Green and the state of Wisconsin. They claimed that Taliesin was not a non-profit school, but a for-profit architectural practice. They billed Wright almost $20,000 for back taxes. Wright said he would instead leave Wisconsin, burn Taliesin to the ground, and leave the ashes as a memorial to his ancestors. His supporters were horrified. They quickly planned a testimonial dinner to honor Wright and raise money to pay his tax bill. Wright told the audience he was born in Wisconsin and he belonged in Wisconsin. Wright also used the dinner to show off his model of the Monona Terrace. He was 87 years old and still fighting to deliver his great gift to his hometown.
As great a genius as he was, he needed and wanted to be praised. He wanted more than anything else to have a major building in his own hometown.
Despite the sentiments at the dinner, forces opposing Wright's design were still determined to stop it. One local businessman called the aging Wright a deadbeat womanizer and a communist.
What's wrong with communism? You just agree.
Communism is utterly, from my standpoint, wrong. I'm an individualist.
You love the people of Russia.
World as such.
You love the people of Russia, but you do not love their government.
That's right. I despise their government and said so. I haven't heard a word from Russia all these years. And it would make them laugh in Russia if they ever heard of it. I don't suppose they have. That I've been accused of communistic sympathies in my own country.
Despite the controversy, the city signed a contract with Wright to build the revised Monona Terrace plan. But this time, the state legislature passed a bill limiting the height of buildings on the isthmus. It was designed to stop the Monona Terrace. Wright said the bill was the work of unconscientious objectors. the bill was repealed. The Monona Terrace battles and attacks on his personal character did little to slow Wright. He designed and built a Unitarian church in Madison, the Guggenheim Museum of Art in New York City, and the Greek Orthodox Church in Milwaukee. He continued to renovate Taliesin and Taliesin West in Arizona. Nearly a third of all his commissions came in the last 10 years of his life. Yet, despite his worldwide success, he did not live to see his dream built. He signed the specifications of the Monona Terrace in March of 1959. On April 6th, Frank Lloyd Wright died in a Phoenix hospital. He was 2 months shy of his 92nd birthday. The battle for the Monona Terrace continued after Wright's death. The design was revised again, and when construction bids came in, $4 million over the amount approved by voters, the Monona Terrace stalled. This time, a conservative city government succeeded in getting the Monona Terrace issue on the ballot again. In 1962, the Monona Terrace was defeated, and Taliesin architects had to go to court to get paid.
The building should extend to the water, and in some instances, perhaps over the water. Why not?
After what seemed to be the final defeat of the Monona Terrace, the plans again returned to the Taliesin architects' vaults. The Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation continued after his death under the direction of Wright's widow, Olga Vanna. As for Madison, the debate continued over what to build and where to build it. Every new city election brought a new twist to the debate. In 1980, Madison bought and renovated a Montgomery Ward store and movie theater, and finally opened the Civic Center 41 years after Wright's dream Civic Center proposal. The Monona Terrace site, a parcel of land coveted by developers since the turn of the century, remained undeveloped. In the 80s, Madison debated the need for a downtown convention center, and, like the Monona Terrace before it, the idea died. In 1988, Madison elected Paul Soglin mayor. Also in 1988, a group of Madisonians approached Taliesin architects about the feasibility of updating Wright's Monona Terrace plan. Mayor Soglin appointed a commission to study the feasibility of a downtown convention center. The commission brought together a group of city, county, state, and private concerns, something that could never happen in Wright's day. It was, after all, the Madison business community that most vigorously opposed Wright's Monona Terrace plan in the 50s. In June of 1990, Soglin announced his support of a convention center on the shores of Lake Monona, inspired by the 1938 design of architect Frank Lloyd Wright.
The beauty of the design is in a way timeless, and one of the fortunate aspects of all of this is while there are a number of Frank Lloyd Wright's buildings that he designed for which the drawings are still available, we had the site. We still had the site available as he envisioned it.
1 year later, the committee recommended to the mayor and the Common Council that the city proceed with the Monona Terrace as a community and meeting facility. After another vigorous community debate, voters agreed. After 57 years of hopes, political sabotage, and hostilities, construction began on the Monona Terrace. Somehow, an idea that divided a community for decades was about to bring a community together. Taliesin architect Tony Putman, who began as a draftsman for Frank Lloyd Wright in 1953, is the architect responsible for building Wright's dream.
It's very good to build a building, and it's kind of fun to build a building that has already withstood the test of time.
There's a generation in Madison who can divorce their feelings about Frank Lloyd Wright as a person and look at Frank Lloyd Wright as an architect and are now building it. It puts Madison in a different category as a city now.
Terrace follows the design Wright updated in 1959 when he modified his original plans for a civic auditorium. It will be a convention center and a community meeting place.
The vision of the building has been preserved. And Mr. Wright's vision was that, as he said, the city should be a celebration of circumstance. And this is a building which celebrates its circumstance, both using and following very faithfully Mr. Wright's design for the inside and the outside in terms of architectural treatment, and forming that link between the lake and the city.
As the Monona Terrace opens its doors 58 years after Frank Lloyd Wright designed it, the world is likely to marvel at this dream of Frank Lloyd Wright's. A dream that seems to float over Lake Monona, like the dream of a boy who played along its shores. As Frank Lloyd Wright's Monona Terrace opens, there remains controversy. Some will ask, how can this be a Frank Lloyd Wright building when he died almost 40 years before its construction? Others will ask where the Monona Terrace fits in Wright's remarkable legacy. A few thoughts when Frank Lloyd Wright's last dream continues.
My real aim is not only to get better architects for America, but to leave behind me some better architecture.
Frank Lloyd Wright liked to say that his best building is his next one. As the Monona Terrace welcomes the world, it will also welcome the students and critics of Wright. They will ask the same questions asked since Wright died in 1959. Is this Monona Terrace truly a Frank Lloyd Wright building? And if it is, where is its place in his legacy?
The short, succinct answer to is this a Frank Lloyd Wright building is the building is inconceivable without it.
The name of Frank Lloyd Wright is still magic. And I traveled all over the world, and if things get dull, all I have to mention is the fact that I worked for Frank Lloyd Wright, and the whole conversation changes.
Wright is becoming a Mozart, a Bach, a Beethoven, maybe even a Washington or a Jefferson, somebody who's made a major difference in the world in their time.
And he would have smiled, he probably did, wherever he is, smiled and said, well, it only took him 60 years or so to get around to it.
Frank Lloyd Wright fought for his dream the last 21 years of his life. He heard his design debated and praised. He endured what at times were vicious attacks on his character. Wright received only one payment for his work, $1,000 from a group of private citizens who asked him to design the Monona Terrace in 1938. I'm Bill Curtis.
I would like to make it appropriate to the Declaration of Independence, to the center line of our freedom. I'd like to have a free architecture. I'd like to have architecture that belonged where you see it standing.